is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Oh, Lord, we've been struggling so long. Oh, Lord, we've been struggling so long. Oh, Lord, we've been struggling so long. We must be free. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Oh, Lord, we've been struggling so long. Oh, Lord, we've been struggling so long. Oh, Lord, we've been struggling so long. We must be free. Mr. Williams?
Thank you. When I talk about Mary D. Williams, I often refer to her as the incomparable Mary D. Williams, and I couldn't think of a better way to get us centered, get us rooted, get us started this afternoon than to have her voice be the first voice that you heard this afternoon. So thank you so much. And you're going to hear more from Ms. Williams, and I'll do an introduction in a few minutes. But I wanted to take a moment to say welcome to all of you for being here this afternoon for this program. My name is James Williams, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, or OCCRC, which is one of the sponsoring organizations for this event. And so again, welcome and thank you. I do want to mention several of our other co-sponsoring entities. And this came about, well, basically last year, the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition did a program commemorating the, I think, 60-year anniversary of the Freedom Rides of 1961. And so toward the end of last year, it dawned on me that we were approaching the 75-year anniversary of the original Freedom Rise, the journey of reconciliation. So I convened a small group of people to see if there was interest in doing some programming commemorating that event. And one reason that I thought it was so important was because what happened right here in Chapel Hill and in Orange County related to the 1947 riot. And so basically, those organizations came to the table, and we have done, I think, an incredible job of collaborating and working together. And as it relates to this particular program, we, in addition to the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, which, just briefly, I will say about OCCRC. OCCRC was established in the fall of 2018. And succinctly put, our purpose, our goal, our mission is to partner with the Equal Justice Initiative to educate and engage the public on the history of racial terror and racial terror lynching, both, within Orange County, within the state, and within the nation. And also to have a better understanding of how that history contributes to our present reality. But our goal is not just, I want to say not just to talk about history. I don't say that way to diminish the importance of talking about history, because history, I think, is an important tool to changing our current reality, to understanding what we need to do, kind of how we got to this place, and also what we can do to improve where we are. And so that's basically what we do, OCCRC. You may have seen some publications out at the table that EJI provides for us to distribute to the public when we have events, and so I hope you'll take advantage of that. Also, though, the Carolina Public Humanities is a major partner for this event, and I want to say a couple of things about them. Carolina Public Humanities is a program at UNC Chapel Hill offering public programming in the humanities, arts, and sciences that provide insights and facilitates dialogue to help us connect and engage with diverse ideas and challenges. And their affiliate, Carolina K through 12, serves K through 12 teachers all around the state to better understand and to be in a better position to teach what is referred to as hard history, so that we can have a better appreciation and understanding of our racial past. And I do want to lift up Christy Norris, who has just done yeoman's work. I've worked with her on a number of events, and I'm so grateful and thankful for what she brings to the table. She rolls up her sleeves and she goes to work. Also, I want to thank the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough for their promotional support. And even though they're not listed as a co-sponsor, I want to thank the Chapel Hill Carborough NAACP, because they have done a real good job of helping to promote this event. And finally, but not least important, funding for this event is provided by the Humanities for the Public Good, an initiative at UNC Chapel Hill's College of Arts and Sciences. So, why are we here? I mean, we're here, as Brian Stevenson says, we're here to talk about an injustice. We're talking about a travesty of justice, Judge, if you will, about a miscarriage of justice, Judge Webster. A miscarriage of justice that took place right here in Orange County 75 years ago on this very date, May 20th, 1947, in Chapel Hill Recorder's Court, there were 4 men, 2 white, 2 black, who were sentenced to 30 days on the chain gang in their crime, exercising their constitutional rights. And they were embarked upon what is referred to as the journey of reconciliation. And our program is entitled The 1947 Journey of Reconciliation, A Long Road to Justice. And the 4 men, including Bayard Rustin, who were prosecuted and convicted and sent to the chain gang here in Orange County, were 4 of 16 courageous, brave writers who set out to test whether or not stations and bus companies would comply with the U.S. Supreme Court decision that had been decided the year before that said it was unconstitutional to force black people to, quote, ride Jim Crow. And so they were on this journey, and we call this a long road to justice because they were not the first to embark upon this journey, a journey toward justice and equality and freedom. It started at least as early as 1619 when the first people that looked kind of like me were brought to these shores, at least to the colonies that eventually became the United States of America. And they weren't the last. There were a number of people who came after them. But it is so important that we talk about what they did, what they attempted to do, what happened to them here, and how we should be, because we're still on that journey now, and how we need to be as committed, as courageous, and to do our part to create that society that these men in this journey had embarked upon in their work. And so we put together a program that I think it's going to be a good program. I'm just excited about our presenters and our panelists. You just heard, as I mentioned, from Mary D. Williams. And, it's hard for me to kind of, I'm going to read a description that, it has to be correct because it's on her website. So, and I know that, from an educational standpoint, she has a BA in American Studies and an MA in Folklore. But on the website, it says that Mary has truly developed into a public educator, studying North Carolina history and culture through the lens of Black gospel. Another person has described her as a great vocalist and singer, but so much more than that, because when you hear her, you are also hearing the voices of the elders and the ancestors. And you got some of that a few minutes ago. I think what I'll do is allow Ms. Williams to, I don't know, I was about to say baptize us, but at least bring that music to us again, and then we'll move forward with our keynote speaker and other aspects of our program. Thank you so much.
The meeting at the building will
the shouting at the, oh Lord, and soon.
So what just happened? We had an opportunity to have an experience in this room, in this place. And if you weren't in this room at that particular time, having that experience, nobody else knows anything about it because they were not here. They didn't have the opportunity to participate. What happened? We started with one song and we built a community in just a few moments. Lyrically. Because if you go out into the street right now and try to sing that song, those people in passing couldn't capture it. They couldn't go along with you as quickly as those in this room when you begin to share it again, because we will remember this time in this space. Music has that kind of power. When the enslaved began to use songs as a method of messaging, it was the most powerful weapon that they could have possibly used. This music was passed from generation to generation orally. I know I learned it from my grandmother who lived in Smithfield, North Carolina. And she would embrace certain songs at certain times, particularly when we would go to Belk downtown on Main Street. Because Granddaddy would be the driver, of course, and I could sit in the middle of them because there were no safety belt laws. So I could sit in between them as we went through downtown where the big bulletin board was saying, "Welcome to KKK country." And my grandmother would take me into the Belk store, hold my hand very tightly, trying to prove to me as her granddaughter that as African Americans in Smithfield, they had the capability to do that, to take their grandbaby shopping. Whereas everything that was in that area at that time was saying, no, that is not the status quo. So she would use songs in those moments of heaviness. And that's how it began to really minister to me and began to really take root in me. And so there in Mr. Williams is why a lot of people that talk about my voice or talk about my contributions in terms of historically, talk about me because of my voice in terms of extension of history or our ancestors. So today I want to talk to you about how these songs matriculated through our history and the impact that they made even here in Chapel Hill, and how the songs out of that African American and at that time the Negro was used to encapsulate moments that actually took them through some times that really were so heavy laden with burdens that only that community was even aware of it. Steal away. Steal away, steal away home. I ain't got long to stay. Here did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel. See, my grandma would moan sometime, and I'd have to ask her, what in the world is that all about? And she'd tell me, baby, when you moan, the devil don't know what you're talking about. Well, I didn't know that she was referring at that time to some of the devils that worked at Hudson Bell. Did my Lord, 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 deliver Daniel and
why not every man go down? Moses way down in Egypt land. Tell all Pharaoh to let the people go. Songs of revenge. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you mourn. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you mourn. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Who could Pharaoh have possibly represented? Revenge. Howard Thurman says that the songs met the need of the present journey. Songs that were congregational and coming up out of the African American sacred music culture. For me, the trajectory of the songs are born out of the moment. Whatever the song was used for to fit the purpose in which it was most useful at the time. It was applied to a particular work. It was applied to whatever was being done at the time. It held an agent of medicinal purposes, a salve, or as Martin Luther King said, a balm in Gilead, to assist with bridging gaps and settling folks down individually as this collective body, building a community in the midst of a body of people that were resolute in their desire to bring about justice. The spirituals where these songs came up out of this reflective expression of how they were feeling. They were prayers. Lord, why come me here? Lord, why come me here? Lord, why come me here? A prayer. I wish I never was born. What we noticed that these songs, as they transitioned during the freedom rides, during the civil rights marches, during the movement, now these songs are used now as a weapon to enable a body or a group of like-minded people to stand their ground. When the enslaved sang, I'm on my way to Canaan land. I'm on my way to Canaan land. I'm on my way to Canaan land. I'm on my way, great God, to Canaan land. They were referring, the enslaved were actually referring to moving from one geographical location to another. It was physical, physically moving. Through the canals and through going to Canada. Many escaped up north, but they were literally talking about getting out of the South and physically sneaking away through the Bush Harbor, running away. But when these same songs were used and applied during the civil rights movement, there was this tenacity and this dogmatic attitude that I'm not going anywhere. Any change that's going to come, it's going to come in my societal situations and the things that are going on in my community. That's the change. That's the dynamic in terms of the Freedom Riders. It was not about simply moving on a Trailways bus from one state to another. It was about the injustice
of having to sit at the back of the bus or not be able to get on the bus at all. Change the situation, change the circumstance. So many of those, as they began to mobilize, they used the same songs as a declarative commitment. They literally changed the words. So let's try it. I'm on my way. To freedom land. 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 Same song. I'm on my way to Canaan. But now I've got the tenacity. I've got the bulldoggedness to say freedom land. Nobody's going to stop me. If you don't go, I'm going anyhow. If you don't go, I'm going anyhow. If you don't go, I'm going anyhow. I'm on my way to freedom land. Oh, let's go. Well, I'm on my way to freedom land. 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 Well, if you don't go, I'm going anyhow. If you don't go, I'm going anyhow. If you don't go, going anyhow. I'm on my way. I'm on my way. I'm on my way to freedom land. Give yourselves a hand. So the enslaved Canaan meant Canada, where many slaves migrated. But during the civil rights movement, the members of the movement changed Canaan to freedom. I'm on my way, great God, to freedom land. The word freedom could not have been used during slavery, so the song cleared the space. It cleared the way in a struggle, in sometimes some of the most critical and some of the most challenging situations. I'm going no matter what. I'm on my way. I don't even know about my time. I'm not even keeping up. You got me? 5 minutes? Oh my God. No. Stay within the guidelines. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's okay. Okay. So Bayard Rustin, as he was such a, many people write about the fact that he could have been a great leader beyond, without what his work that he did behind the scenes. He did so much behind the scenes. So he did so much with Martin Luther King, with so much with A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph really organized the very first March on Washington for the sleeping car porters in terms of labor organization. We mustn't forget that the civil rights, the entire epitaph of the civil rights was not just about race, but it was about some of the same issues that we face today when it comes to housing, jobs. So there's so many intricate parts of it. But the songs gave endurance as folks talked and walked and marched in their local communities. Some ended up in jail. When Bayard Rustin was in jail in Mississippi, in Alabama, he would sing, and they knew that the guards, hearing the songs, they would get agitated, and it would aggravate the guards. Buses are coming, oh yeah. Buses are coming, oh yeah. Buses are coming, buses are coming, buses are coming, oh yeah. Fannie Lou Hamer talked about it, how that they would get so agitated when all of the different workers, once they were arrested or the Freedom Riders were arrested, how that they would get so angry. If you all don't stop that singing, we're gonna take your mattress. You can take my mattress, oh yeah. You can take my mattress, oh yes. You can take my mattress, you can take my mattress. You can take my mattress, oh yeah. Better get ye ready, oh yeah. If you all don't stop that singing, we're gonna take your toothbrush. You can take my toothbrush, oh yeah. You can take my toothbrush, oh yes. The power of music. The power that got them through situations where the prison was so tight, it was so small, with so many people impacted within one cell, and how that they used music as this anthem to secure them. Because yes, we want our freedom. Yes, we want our freedom, children. Yes, we want our freedom. We want our freedom, and we want it now. In my closing that I got to and didn't even realize I was getting there. Bayard Rustin called for angelic troublemakers, using the weapon of the physical body to keep wheels from turning. Buses are coming, you better get ready. Working with A. Philip Randolph as he worked with the sleeping car porters. Taking songs that came out of the traditions. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up the freedom's way. They took songs like Rockin' Jerusalem. Oh, Mary, oh, Martha, oh, Mary, ring them bells. They, while in jail one night, decided they'd take that song and recreate it. Oh, Pritchett, oh, Kelly, oh, Pritchett, open them cells. I hear God's children, they're crying for mercy. I hear God's children, they're praying in jail. Bond's getting higher. The bond is getting higher. Open them cells. When Bayard Rustin was here in this area and was arrested and actually placed on the chain gang for 30 days, hard labor for riding on the freedom rides. They took songs that came from the church and they used them as they navigated. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah,
don't, well, thank you. It doesn't get any better than that. And I don't know, if we're really nice, maybe at some point in the program, she might be enticed to do another song. I mean, okay. But you know, there were a couple of things that you raised that I want to speak to briefly. And one is this thing called, because you know, when you say the words, it doesn't sound really that bad. Riding Jim Crow. I mean, but oh my God, the indignity, the humiliation, even the danger that, you know, just taking a simple trip from point A to point B, what people had to go through. No class lines, it didn't matter if you managed a store or you owned 200 acres of land. If you were black, you had to ride in the back. And the other thing that you mentioned is, you know, this issue being sort of such a flashpoint issue for black resistance and organization and mobilization. Some of those efforts was just an individual at a particular moment in time said, I'm not going to do it. And others were more organized efforts. But yeah, this. And so by the time we get to the journey of reconciliation in 1947, and those riders ended up here in Chapel Hill, and it was here that they suffered the worst acts of violence, that they had 4 people arrested and they had people ended up serving prison sentences, and how that all happened and why it happened in Chapel Hill. So, but there's another part of that story, because there were some people who stood up, you know, and certainly, you know, Reverend Jones comes to mind, and the students who helped get the riders to Greensboro safely. So there's the harm, there's the horror, but there's also the promise of what can happen when people come together and do what we know is right. And there's more that can be said about that, but I want to transition to our next speaker, our keynote speaker. And, you know, there are a lot of people that one can say, this person needs no introduction. Well, you know, could clearly say that about Gene Nickel, but I'll do a brief introduction anyway. Professor Nickel is the Boyd Tinsley Professor of Law at UNC. I think he also has in his bio, I think he's been dean of at least 2 law schools, if I'm not mistaken. But he's a writer. He's written 2 books. He's a poverty expert. He's, I think, the director of the Poverty Research Fund. It used to be the UNC Poverty Center. But he's also, when we talk about, you know, talking truth to power and just being brutally honest when taking on our policymakers and our politicians, some of the most powerful op-eds that one can read are those that have been written by Gene Nickel. I hope at some point they'll be collected in a book. There's a lot more that one could say about him, but I'll just turn it over to Professor Gene Nickel at this point.
Thank you very much, James, for that kindness. I know every one of you is feeling sorry for me. Not as much as I'm feeling sorry for me. I have a few times in my life had to follow Mary Williams before. You just don't want to do it. My thought was we could cancel this program and have more songs because nothing I do is going to approach that. Let me promise you. If you're too worried about my psyche, though, I will say this. If I get too beaten down and insecure for having to follow Mary Williams, all I'm going to do is walk right out to my car, which is only half a block here, pull out my Mary Williams CD, and put on Let My People Go, and it'll sort of repair me. So I don't want you to worry that the damage is going to be permanent. You know, Mary, I was thinking about this when I was younger, a different kind of professor. I spent a couple days with Andrew Young, and I am a sort of a worshiper of Fannie Lou Hamer, and I asked Andrew Young about Fannie Lou Hamer, and she also had this powerful, tremendous voice. And Andrew said, in some of these great civil rights marches that they had, he said, we don't like to talk about it very much, but we were terrified before we would leave. It was scary. And whenever that happened, we would ask Mrs. Hamer to sing. And Miss Hamer would sing, and one, he said, it would calm us down. But secondly, he said, if that little woman is not scared, what right do we have to be scared? So it would get us, it would get our courage up, and we would go through the streets of Selma or Birmingham. Mrs. Hamer, Mrs. Williams, it's an honor to be in the room. I have been asked to bring a word. I notice in my old age, I'm never asked to bring the word, which is as it should be. So I want to bring a word about this historic gathering. As Mary reported, Bayard Rustin said famously, in every community we need a group of angelic troublemakers. Warren Zevon would put it slightly differently 50 years later. You're my witness, I'm your mutineer. I'm a constitutional lawyer by trade. We study obsessively United States Supreme Court decisions. Sometimes when we're feeling ambitious, we branch out. That usually means looking to the justices or the advocates, those who've had a potent and sometimes lasting impact on the meaning and enforceability of the American Constitution. But the Constitution is not self-enforcing. It is a remarkable document, but it doesn't enforce itself. I thought of this dramatically some years ago. In one of the high honors of my life, I was invited down to an annual gathering in Summerton, South Carolina, Clarendon County, a tiny town, still having less than 1,000 people. You pass it on I-95 if you're headed down towards Myrtle Beach. And there every summer in May, the extended families of Reverend Joseph Delane and his wife Mattie, along with the families of and descendants of Harry Briggs, they gather to mark and celebrate and pray over the life of their parents and grandparents and grandparents. Reverend Delane was the leader of an astonishingly brave group of plaintiffs in Briggs against Elliott, which became one of the principal cases of Brown against Board of Education. He was the pastor of Spring Hill Church, a teacher at the Bob Johnson School, and in that capacity, he helped convince 20 heroic plaintiffs to sign on to the case with him, despite the dangers, known, more than known dangers. Reverend Delane and his wife Mattie were both immediately fired from their jobs as teachers. White merchants cut off all their credit. Reverend Delane's church was bombed. Their home was burned down. Klansmen rained down bullets on the couple and their children repeatedly. On one particularly brutal night, Reverend Delane shot back, defending his home and his family. He was immediately charged with assault, forcing him to leave South Carolina for years. My point, he knew all of this was coming. How could he not have? It was written across the sky, chapter and verse, a single finger scroll. But he did it, they did it, so that their kids could have a better life than they had. They did it to try to make the promises of the Constitution real, rather than a cruel hypocrisy. To make America be America, sacrifice which is difficult to fathom. Thurgood Marshall would write of the Delanes, "There isn't a threat known to men that they did not receive. They were never out from under the pressure. I don't think I could have stood it for a week. The possibility of violent death for them and their families is something that they had to learn to live with. Like a man learns to sleep with a sore arm. Like learning to sleep with a sore arm." The Delanes are South Carolina's first citizens, whether South Carolina knows it or not. No South Carolinian has contributed so much to the American experiment, the foundational American promise. John C. Calhoun, my ass. No, the Constitution is not self-enforcing, as the journey of reconciliation teaches so powerfully, so relentlessly, so unalterably. The Constitution can't do it on its own. 3 snapshots, short one longer, one in between. 3 years before the 1947 journey of reconciliation, Irene Morgan got on a Greyhound bus in Hayes Store, Virginia. The 27-year-old mother of 2 was heading back to Baltimore, recuperating from a miscarriage with her mother in Gloucester, Virginia, heading back to Maryland to her husband and her doctor, hoping for a clean bill of health to return to work in a defense plant building B-26s. The bus was jam-packed from Norfolk, no empty seats. Another young black woman generously offered her lap. Later, Mrs. Morgan moved to a seat where another passenger had departed. It was 3 rows from the back, but still in front of a couple of white passengers, so violating Virginia's segregation laws. The bus driver turned on Miss Morgan in a rage. She offered a compromise, saying she'd switch seats with the white couple behind her. The driver cursed her and went to fetch the sheriff. Recuperating from miscarriage or not, the sheriff and his deputy dragged Miss Morgan off the bus. They said they grabbed her because she had torn up the arrest warrant. But Miss Morgan explained later what actually happened. His male pride wouldn't let him tell the truth, she said. The sheriff put his hands on me, and when he did, I kicked him in a very bad place. He had to hobble off the bus, and his deputy came back on. He tried to put his hands on me too. I was going to bite him, but he was too dirty, so I clawed him instead. I ripped his shirt. The deputy said, "When I get you to jail, I'll beat your head in." I said, "I guess we'll whip each other, won't we?" None of us ever got to meet Miss Morgan. I wish I could have. God love her. But she was apparently not a pristine disciple of Mahatma Gandhi and Bayard Rustin. Miss Morgan represented herself before the Middlesex County Circuit Judge, saying that the segregation laws couldn't apply to interstate travel. The judge said Virginia law prevailed, as later did the Virginia Supreme Court. Miss Morgan was right on the legal question. Virginia was wrong. Spotswood Robinson, Oliver Hill, Thurgood Marshall took her case to the United States Supreme Court. Morgan against the Commonwealth of Virginia. There, the NAACP argued, and I quote, "Today we are just emerging from a war which all the people of the United States were joined in a death struggle against the apostles of racism. Surely it is time for this court to declare that federal law no longer sanctions disruptive local racial practices alien to our national ideals and to the solemn undertakings of the community of civilized nations." The Supreme Court agreed in 1946, ruling state segregation laws couldn't constitutionally be applied to interstate travel. Irene Morgan expressed confidence in the court's decision and that it had, quote, "abolished Jim Crow for Northerners heading south. Jim Crow tension has been removed by the ruling," she said. "The insult and degradation to colored people is gone." The Constitution is not self-enforcing. Sometimes even Supreme Court rulings aren't self-enforcing. A second snapshot. Ms. Morgan's prediction didn't come to pass. By late 1946, not much had changed in interstate travel in the South. The Committee of Racial Equality and the Fellowship of Reconciliation, pressed largely by Bayard Rustin and George Hauser, sought to actually enforce the Morgan decision through not what we now think of as the first freedom ride, the journey of reconciliation of 1947. Not civil disobedience, when you think about it, but testing the enforcement of a Supreme Court declaration, supporting law, not challenging it, moving across the Upper South from DC to Nashville, intentionally avoiding, ironically, the treacherous Deep South. They wanted to stick to the more civilized places like Frank Graham's Chapel Hill where they actually met the greatest violence. Not the whole civil rights community supported the journey. Thurgood Marshall worried it would provoke a bloodbath. Rustin pushed back, saying, quote, "Unjust social laws and patterns do not change because Supreme Courts deliver just opinions. Social progress comes from struggle. All freedom demands a price. Courtroom arguments will not suffice for the rights the black masses today demand." So, as James said, 16 white and black riders, all male, unlike the 1961 Freedom Riders, including Rustin and Hauser and Jim Peck, the only member who also went on the later Freedom Ride, and 4 North Carolinians, Joseph Felmet, Ernest Bromley, Lewis Adams, Eugene Stanley. They left Washington, D.C. on April 9th, facing only modest challenges in Richmond and Petersburg and Oxford. In Durham, 3 riders were arrested on April 12th, though the charges were later dropped. Chapel Hill, as you know, was different. Here the riders were hosted by the marvelous Reverend Charlie Jones, then of the United Presbyterian Church. Jones and his friends met the protesters at the station. The bus riders then attended a meeting with students and faculty on Saturday night and joined Jones' services at church on Sunday morning. But as they boarded the bus afterwards, the Trailways driver ordered them to the back. And when they refused, he went to the police station just down the street to demand their arrest. Jim Peck shuffled back and forth with bail money for the riders. After 2 hours of delays, 5 enraged cab drivers gathered at the bus station, attacked Peck, punching him in the head, screaming at him using every vile, hate-filled racial epithet known to North Carolinians, and then tried to beat Peck's brains out. Not unlike would occur 14 years later on the more famous freedom rides in Anniston, Alabama, where men, women, and children left their Christian Sunday morning services to try, almost successfully, to beat Peck and John Lewis to death, taking the strangest possible lessons from the life of Jesus. But in Chapel Hill, as the danger rose, Reverend Jones took the arrested riders to his parsonage, hoping to get them out of town by car. Automobiles full of irate whites descended on Jones' house with sticks and other weapons. Murderous threats were issued. Student volunteers eventually helped Jones get the riders out. Another threatening crowd gathered at the parsonage in early evening. Hilton Seals, a friend of Jones, was attacked and injured. A student, Ray Sylvester, was knocked unconscious. The terrorized riders eventually escaped to a rousing, supportive mass meeting at Shiloh Baptist Church in Greensboro. Cases against the Freedom Riders were dropped in Durham and in Asheville and dismissed in Virginia, but not in Chapel Hill. The black riders were charged with disorderly conduct and refusing to obey a bus driver. The white riders with interfering with an arrest. They were released on $50 bonds. On May 20, they returned to Orange County for trial, defended by NAACP lawyers Jerry Gates, Henry Taylor, and Ed Avant. The prosecutor, T.J. Phipps, argued, quote, "Our Negroes like Jim Crow." Recorder's clerk judge Henry Whitfield agreed. He sentenced Bayard Rustin to a smaller fine because he was, quote, "a poor misled Negro from outside the South," compared to Eagle Rodunko, who he said was a Jew coming down here to upset the customs of the South. He sentenced Joseph Felmet to 6 months on a chain gang, 6 times the statutory maximum. The Freedom Riders appealed here to the Superior Court in Hillsborough. Judge Chester Morris rejected the Morgan case defense, rejected the United States Supreme Court, and gave equal opportunity sentences. 1 month on a chain gang for both the white and black Freedom Riders. The North Carolina Supreme Court upheld the verdicts and the brutal punishment. Bayard Rustin chose not to appeal the ruling, preferring instead to broadcast the injustice to the world. Felmet and Rodenko agreed, surrendering at the Hillsborough Courthouse on March 21, 1949, where they were transported directly to the Roxboro chain gang. A third story from Roxboro. In one sense, the journey of reconciliation wasn't Bayard Rustin's first freedom ride. In 1942, he refused orders to move to the back of the bus on a trip from Louisville, Kentucky to Nashville, Tennessee. That earned him a roadside beating, an arrest, and a conviction from authorities in Nashville. A police captain screamed racial epithets at him for hours, concluding, "You're supposed to be scared when you come here." Rustin replied, "I'm fortified by the truth, by justice, and by Jesus Christ." The captain claimed he must be crazy. Rustin also served 2 years in federal prison for refusing the draft, where he was treated to solitary confinement for protesting racial segregation in the prison system. It was a battle-tested, Gandhi-instructed, nonviolent warrior for human rights who faced the Orange County-ordered chain gang in Roxboro. Rustin would later write in a widely disseminated report, quote, "Late in the afternoon of Monday, March 21st, 1949, I surrendered to the Orange County Court at Hillsborough, North Carolina, to begin serving a 30-day sentence imposed 2 years earlier for sitting in a bus seat out of the Jim Crow section. His head was shaved. Prisoners got 2 meals a day, one at 7 a.m. and one at noon. Brutal, hot, long, exhausting working conditions. 100 men stacked into 2 small rooms. As one put it, only the clothes we got on, 1 towel and soap, no comb, no toothbrush, no razor, no blades, no stamps, no paper, no pencils, nothing. The first guard who saw Rustin said, "You're the one who thinks he's so smart. You're uppity. But you ain't in Yankee land now, and we won't take any Yankee ways down here." When he accidentally came within 20 feet of a guard, the guard pointed a revolver squarely at his head, saying, "I will shoot the goddamn life out of you." Prisoners were routinely hung on the bar for 72 hours, and none were allowed to move at night without permission. So there was this constant refrain: "Getting up, Captain. Closing the window, Captain. Going to the toilet, Captain." Rustin said, "I didn't sleep soundly one night in my entire sentence in Roxboro, despite being tireder than I had ever been at any time in my life." He refused to wear a cap in the brutal sun so that he wouldn't have to undergo the humiliation of tipping his hat to his jailers. Rustin's sister wrote that he was sexually abused in the state camp, though he didn't write of it. His articles did, though, help end the chain gang system in North Carolina. At the end of his sentence in Roxboro, Rustin walked out with his head held high, undaunted, unshamed, undefeated by his inhuman North Carolina tormentors. As Rustin had told Marshall, all freedom comes at a price. But Orange County, of course, didn't have the final say. In 2013, President Obama awarded Rustin the Presidential Medal of Freedom, praising his march towards freedom, no matter who we are or who we love. So we celebrate this day Bayard Rustin, Irene Morgan, Igor Rodenko, Joseph Felmet, Jim Peck, Charlie Jones, and their brothers, and those sisters and brothers who in the spring and summer of 1961 would follow their example on a more famous and more violently terrifying freedom ride, ending at the barbarous Parchman Prison. Marveling at their bravery, astonished at their selflessness, stunned by their resiliency, astounded by their sacred marriage of hope and steel, awed, literally awed by the shoulders on which we stand. And what might Rustin and Rodenko and Felmet and Peck ask of us today, 75 years later? What would be their interrogation? What would they demand of North Carolinians? What would they ask the people of the Tar Heel State in our own time? First, stunningly, I think they might inquire, can it conceivably be true that 3/4 of a century after our blood and terror and sacrifice, that you are actually governed by all-white Republican caucuses in the North Carolina General Assembly, where they retire to their closed meetings, they draft and agree upon the laws of the state, and not a black person or other person of color appears in the room because there aren't any? That you are ruled by a white person's caucus in 2022, 75 years after we rode, 150 years after the passage of the 14th Amendment. That the Republicans do this, but the rest of us put up with it. In our time, our journeyers might say, the enemies of equality tried to shame us with their violence and their barbarism, and they failed. But we ask you today, have you no shame? How can you do this or allow it to be done in your name? Is this literal denial of America your contributing chapter? And for those riders who put their very lives on the line for civil rights, they may ask, has your General Assembly actually enacted, as the courts have ruled, the largest, most unconstitutional racial gerrymanders ever presented to a judicial tribunal, the most repressive racial voter suppression laws passed by any state in the last half century, and the most extreme political gerrymanders in all of American history, all done in order to crush our nation's defining rights of equal political participation, rights which we made as our lodestar. And have you repealed your famed Racial Justice Act and responded to the marvelous Black Lives Matter movement by making it harder, goddammit, harder to secure the disclosure of police camera video footage? Have you actually said through your words and your deeds that there shall be no racial reckoning here, not in North Carolina, not in the Tar Heel state? And are you dominated in 2022 by a political party that embraces and is apparently run by a declared, emboldened, admitted sedition caucus, seeking the literal overthrow of democratic government in the United States and in North Carolina, literally waging war against government by consent of the governed, saying as North Carolina did in 1860, in 1898, and 1947, and 1961, and 1964, and 1965, that white supremacy should prevail over democracy itself, over the very premise of the American experiment, seeking to do what the Confederates and the Nazis and the fascists and the Soviet Union could never accomplish. And they do this day in and day out, draped in the American flag, as if our flag itself was a symbol of treason. And finally, to those many even in this room, who struggle daily against these outrages, as North Carolina tries to out Mississippi, or to repeal the 20th century, those like me who become weary and faithless and whiny and self-obsessed and timid and fearful. These freedom riders might ask us, did you think that you could be only the heirs of freedom and not its guarantors? That you could claim only freedom's gift, but not its obligation? Did you listen to us when we said, with our bold sisters and brothers, that democracy is never a final achievement, that it is a call to unending struggle, not a perpetually vested birthright? Did you think that we too were not sick and tired of being sick and tired, or exhausted and spent from trying to make a way out of no way? Didn't we have more cause, decidedly more cause for fear and resignation than you do? What, after all, were our odds of success? What was our guarantee of victory? And these riders might whisper to us, gently, but with resolve, in the fullness of time, that the obligations of citizenship are less like ideas than they are deeply felt emotions, like courage and commitment, and ultimately they're to be found only within our own hearts. And they might end by saying, we understand that some of you have grown cynical and given up hope, and perhaps they no longer think we can win this dawning battle. But imagine saying that to Bayard Rustin, or Irene Morgan, or Jim Peck, or Igor Rudenko, or Joseph Feldman, or the Reverend Joseph Delane. Cynicism has no more place in the American experiment than privilege does. As Bayard Rustin told us, liberty requires much of its followers. Unjust laws and patterns do not change merely because Supreme Courts deliver opinions, nor, as we are being reminded this very day, this very month, nor does freedom prosper when the United States Supreme Court further dismantles a long-standing regime of constitutional liberties, flatly abandoning their duties and waging war on democracy itself. Social progress comes, Rustin reminds, from struggle. All freedom demands a price, echoing Frederick Douglass's reminder that power concedes nothing without demand. It never has and it never will. And if there is no struggle, there is no progress. The struggle in North Carolina in 1947, in 2022, that struggle, Rustin teaches, must truly be our own. Democracy's struggle in 1947 and 75 years later must truly be our own. Thank you very much.
So, thank you so much, Jane. Are you gifting me your notes? Okay. Well, you know, that was beautiful. That was also timely, or as we say, on point, because, you know, we're here to commemorate these writers and their effort to bring about, usher in a better world for all of us. But what better way to honor them, and we should honor them, but what better way to honor them than by carrying on the work that they were embarked upon. And so that call to action piece is just so important. So I do want to take just a couple of minutes to kind of put in, context, some other things that were related, things that were happening around the time of these events. You know, the year 1944, and it was in 1944, I think July 16, 1944, that Miss Morgan, refused to get out of her seat, as Jane just spoke about. But that same year, on July 6th of 1944, a person by the name of Jackie Robinson, he had just recently been commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army, and he was transferred to Fort Hood, Texas. And on July 6, 1944, while en route back to the base on a bus, he was arrested for refusing to move back into the Jim Crow section of the bus. He was court-martialed, but eventually acquitted. A couple of days later, on July 8th, and closer to home, July 8th, 1944, Private Booker T. Spicely. He was a private in the U.S. Army. He was stationed at Camp Butner in Butner, North Carolina. He was shot and killed by a bus driver following exchange of words with the driver when Spicely resisted going to the back of the bus. But mind you, at the time he was shot and killed, he had left the bus. He had gotten off the bus. This bus driver, driven by racial hatred and supremacy, fired 2 shots into this man's chest and then was ultimately acquitted by a jury of his peers. That's July 8th, 1944. July 16, Irene Morgan. And then, we moved to, June 3rd, 1946 was when the U.S. Supreme Court decided the Morgan case, saying that it was unconstitutional to separate drivers by race on interstate public transportation. Well, I think it was February 2nd of 1944, here again, another black man in uniform, just discharged from the U.S. Army, on his way home, Isaac Woodard, in a little town in South Carolina, is brutally beaten, and his eyes, he's blinded, his eyes basically gouged out, stemming from an argument with a bus driver in rural South Carolina. And of course, the riders were here in Chapel Hill April 12 and 13 of 1947. And I just mentioned Jackie Robinson and his experience. Well, guess what? April 15, 1947, Jackie Robinson broke the so-called color line, starting in a Major League Baseball game for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And also, it's worth noting that in August of 1947, John Hope Franklin's classic, From Slavery to Freedom, was published. And he actually was in Durham the week that the Freedom Riders were coming through this area. He was, I think, in the process of moving from Durham to D.C. because he was changing teaching positions from North Carolina Central to Howard. So, anyway, I just kind of thinking in context some of the other things that were going on at that time. Moving on with our program, our next presenter will be C.J. Suit, who is just an amazing, I think he's described as a performance poet, an arts educator, a community organizer from Chapel Hill. He is also Chapel Hill's first poet laureate. CJ.
Thank y'all so much for having me here today. This is an interesting experience. One, because usually when I'm in this room, it's a different situation. I'm nervous for a whole other set of reasons. And I believe it's important. Mr. Williams was just talking about context, and it's important, I think, not just to place ourselves in historical context, but in present context. Thank you so much. Mr. Nichols, for talking about that at the end of your talk, and Ms. Williams, every time, just amazing. And I think as a youth, as a young person, it feels really important to bring the context of where we are right now. And so particularly, like, we are in a space that on Wednesdays or Tuesdays, or whatever the day of the week it is filled in these benches with black and brown faces, right? And poor white faces. And speckled here and there. There might be some more wealthy folks who couldn't afford to send a lawyer to court, right? But those seats you're sitting in are usually filled with black and brown faces that are not going to get out of this building more often than not with paying at least $200-$300, right? And so it's very important, like, for us to also, like, center ourselves. And so what I came to share with you today is a bit of an excerpt. Back in 2008, we did a historical reenactment of the Freedom Rides, 1947 Freedom Rides. I played Bayard Rustin. My hair was a little shorter then, added a little baby powder, and I played Bayard Rustin, and we segregated the audience in Hargrave Center in Chapel Hill. And we went through, some of you in the room, I believe, were at that performance in 2008. And so I started to read over the work from that time, and I felt like it needed an update. Because of that piece I was just talking to you about context. And much of the work that I do, I talk about bridge building and being a bridge. And one of the core tenets of that work is that bridges cannot choose sides. They must be grounded in at least two places. Most bridges are grounded in more than two places, right? But must be grounded in two places. Now, oftentimes, when we look back at history, we often think about history in terms of sides, the right side, the wrong side. But I like to believe that Bayard Rustin, Yigal Rudenko were being bridges in that moment. Bridges between a law that had been passed but was not being implemented. Bridges between a culture of people who would rather not stir up things, in some cases, and between their children and children's children who needed to live in a different world. And so that feels really important. I also believe in the context of contextualizing what is happening now. And I know I'm gonna do a poem. I promise I'm gonna get to the poem, right? That if I really think about it, part of the issue with black folks getting on a bus and sitting in front of white folks is that white folks were then faced with the reality of the injustice, right? It's like, now all of a sudden I got to look at your nappy hair in front of me, right? All of a sudden I have to look at your outfit, which is probably, less quality, or in some cases more quality than mine, right? And I'm faced with that reality right in front of me. And so I think the law, in many ways, that black folks had to sit in the back was an attempt to hide the injustice. Is that you can ride the bus, but you need to sit in the back so I don't have to deal with it, right? I'll look at you when I'm getting on the bus way back there in the back, but when I sit down, I don't want to have to take this whole trip looking at the injustice. So I'd like for us to think, again, before I get into the poem, I promise I'm going to get there, is that what are ways in our world that we are hiding injustice? I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, right? And I have an elder in the community who often says that, like, all the black neighborhoods are in the woods, right? There are several neighborhoods of black folks still in Chapel Hill, and they are hidden in the woods, right? Oftentimes a gentrification that is happening, it is an invisible thing that is happening, hidden, right? So what are the injustices in our world that are hidden? All right, I'm gonna get into the poem because my auntie, I grew up in the Southern Pentecostal Church. My auntie used to say, you don't wanna make people happy twice. That's right. Happy to see you get up and happy to see you sit down. Also in the vein of the Southern Pentecostal Church, this is an interactive experience. And sometimes we come to spaces like this and we just feel like we're there to sit and fold our hands And you think of poetry as like roses are red, violets are blue, I love you, right? But often in my poetry tradition, we say poetry. Poetry is not like golf. Now, is there any golfers in the building? I'm not hating on golf. I'm just saying you don't have to wait to the end of this poem to be like, oh, that was lovely. Par 4. Right, you don't have to do that. You can make noise all up and through this poem. You're not going to throw me off. Cool. You can snap if you feel like snapping. By all means, by the end of the poem, you can make all that noise. Also, you can make what we affectionately call the grandma cookie noise, which sounds a little bit like, yeah, yeah, cool. So 75 years ago, a group of men went on a mission, a fellowship of reconciliation. Worth Randall, Wallace Nelson, Ernest Bromley, James Peck, Egal Rudenko, James Spellman, George Hauser, Andrew Johnson, and Bayard Rustin. I want to talk about Bayard Rustin for a moment, a poet, a creative, an older brother to Dr. King, an organizer of the March on Washington, a gay man, shamed within the movement for the way he chose to love, so he chose to play the background so we could live in the open now. An organizing mind unmatched in his generation. Got over 250,000 people to the March on Washington without a Google Drive, no email, just synapses firing freedom, actualizing a dream, able to see the mountaintop from the valley. Speaking of the valley, or rather the hill in the valley, April 13th, 1947, a bus rolled through Chapel Hill on the corner of Rosemary and Columbia. Stopped after the law had been passed that colored folk don't have to ride. Jim Crow, a fellowship of reconciliation, chose to get confirmation of the legislation, make sure the law was enforced. They understood that that day was an opportunity for change. Not the type they gave to the driver, but the change that drives you as they toured 7 states in a month. Riding buses in places it was legal to, the tears of a war-torn past, pushing them into present protest, fighting not against flesh and blood, but ideals twisted and convoluted, mangled by the hands of Jim Crow. The color of the skin does not determine what section of the bus they should sit in. We all breathe the same air, love with the same convictions. How can it be? The melanin in them causes their convictions. During the trial, as we heard DA TJ Phipps said, our niggas wanted Jim Crow. Guess if we perform like marionettes hanging from the vines of an impressive social structure, we could call that strange fruit. The judge refers to Egal Rudenko as Radinki and asks if he's Jewish. Then says, well, it's about time you Jews from the north learn that you can't come down here with your niggas from the north upsetting the customs of the south. I imagine Rudenko thought, what customs? We got racism in the north. The south hasn't cornered the market, just a few riders. Little did he know, 13 years later, there would be a Chapel Hill 9, or that Elizabeth Cotton has been picking freight train freedom, or 20 years later, Howard Lee will be the mayor of this southern part of heaven, where the riders went through hell. Sentenced to time on the chain gang, Bayard Rustin wrote a reflection of this time in an article called 22 Days on the Chain Gang. This reflection led to the discontinuing of the chain gang in North Carolina. He is proof that not only the story matters, but the sharing of it. That silence is where the violence persists. We are not as far from this history as we can feel. 3 white youth create a George Floyd challenge. The body cam footage goes unreleased. 45 conjures the ghost of a Miami police chief with a tweet. When the looting starts, the shooting starts. And here it is, the pearly white teeth of a hungry country, the belly of a beast. Corporate demagogues watch it eat, feed it their children or neighbors or friends, sleep sweet. The stomach growling lullabies, the influencers advertise new brands of chow, dance the new personas, most appetizing to the people eater. In fact, they believe in the brand, believe the choreography renders them immune to the digestive process. They are only stomach lining, keeping us all inside. I imagine I imagine whiteness and privilege as a bully on a beach who has scooped out all the sand around him to make himself feel taller, balanced on a diabolical pedestal, and every time a black or brown indigenous person thrives a little, sand goes back in, and that perceived threat means death. Means the denial of any form of reparations, justice, or health. Another rural hospital closes. Any meaningful change dissipates that perceived threat. Manifests itself in human form. Karen shows up to the beach ready to teach, scooping handfuls of equity and progression, pupils dilated with an obsession with regression, drunk off red line punch and mint juleps with eugenics garnish, missing a time when our country was great, says you can call her old-fashioned, or the good old days, or in the words of Julian Carr, when the bottom rail was on top, when folks knew their place. And here we are in this space, in it deep again, once again, finding our way through as the writers did, sourcing the resilience of enslaved Africans and the medicine magic of indigenous peoples. How powerful for our attention to be called in this moment to breathing as the planet finally gets to take a breath as we inhale the last breaths of Tony McDade to strengthen our fight of Monique and Diamond, of Nina Pop and George and Brianna and Trayvon and Rakia and Kayla, every person whose life was cut short due to an unjust law or just the law of the land. Freedom is a thing we must fight for. We must live it in our conversations with friends and neighbors, vote for it as we see each other every day, love each other forward. We must choose our battles so our children do not have to fight the same ones. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, CJ. Wonderful. I think we're still doing good on time. I wonder, because it looks like I'm the next thing on the program, but I wonder if we might get a little song, a little thing here from before I... whatever you want to do.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. We gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking in the freedom name. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around.
Thank you for that. Just what I needed. So before I make my remarks, I want to, Ethan Leslie Flatt, are you in the room? He is. So I wanted to acknowledge Ethan. When we first started thinking about doing something related to the journey of reconciliation, and realizing that the Fellowship of Reconciliation, or FOR, and the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, were the sponsors of this ride, and started checking to see if those organizations were still in existence and if there was someone we might involve. And so it turns out that Ethan is the interim director or co-director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And he has been a valuable member of our planning committee. And he drove all the way from Asheville, and will be driving back this evening, I believe, to attend this. And I thought it was worth acknowledging that. So, given that this is about a legal injustice and that there was a trial, and despite that these 4 individuals ended up convicted, 3 actually served time on the chain gang. But I didn't want us to lose sight of the fact that there were some courageous and dedicated lawyers who stood up, who stood in the breach, and who advocated on behalf of the 4 riders here in Orange County, and also 2 in Asheville. So there were 3 attorneys who represented the 4 here. There were 3 attorneys, 2 from Durham, 1 from Raleigh. There was an attorney from Winston-Salem who represented the Asheville defendants, and they were all African-American attorneys. And I say that not to say that it's unusual. During that period of time, most of the people fighting legal battles on behalf of black people, especially in the South and the Southeast, were black lawyers, even though there weren't a lot of black lawyers at that time, for a number of reasons that's beyond the scope of this talk. But I want to talk about Caswell Jerry Gates of Durham, Ed Avant of Durham, Herman L. Taylor of Raleigh, and a couple of other attorneys who were involved in representing freedom riders and other civil rights activists in this state. There's a headline in the Carolina Times announcing the death of Caswell Jerry Gates in 1970, and it reads, "Pioneer civil rights lawyer succumbs." And Gates was one of the earlier civil rights lawyers in the state of North Carolina. He earned his law degree from Boston University and began practicing law in Durham in 1927. Gates and Ed Avant were among the first black lawyers in the state to routinely take on an active role in litigating civil rights cases in this state. They, in 1933, the 2 of them were representing a black man in Vance County, a young black boy, actually, 16 years old, who had been accused of kidnapping and raping a white girl. One day after court, it was late in the evening, they were shot at by a mob and chased by a mob as they were leaving the courtroom. And I mention this to say, C.J. Gates knew about the danger of mob violence. He had encountered it himself. In addition, those two attorneys, C.J. Gates and Ed Avant, represented Ellen Harris. Ellen Harris was a black woman who, in 1938, refused to give up her seat on a Durham public bus to move to the back of the bus when ordered to do so by the bus driver. She was tried in Durham District and Superior Court, convicted, despite the efforts of Gates and Ed Avant, but they didn't give up. They appealed the case to the North Carolina Supreme Court, where they prevailed. The North Carolina Supreme Court, of course, didn't strike down segregated seating on buses. What they did say, though, was that she didn't violate the law because when she was asked to move, she said, "I will get off the bus if you return my money." The driver refused to return her money, so they said that her violation basically was not intentional. But that's through the work of Ed Avant and C.J. Gates. You know, I mentioned the case in Durham where the rider, the soldier, was shot and killed because he got into an argument related to whether or not he should move. C.J. Gates and another black civil rights attorney in Durham acted as private prosecutors in that case because they were concerned, as were members of the black community and the family of the victim, that the local prosecutors would not vigorously prosecute the case. So these are just some of the types of cases that these attorneys were doing during that time. Even before they took on the case here in Chapel Hill regarding the riders. I could say more, but I want to move on to say a couple of things about Herman L. Taylor, who is the attorney from Raleigh, who was one of the three attorneys representing these four defendants. Herman L. Taylor, he was a graduate of Columbia University School of Law in 1945. He was a member of the bars of New York and North Carolina. His office was located in Raleigh. He also taught at North Carolina Central's Law School for at least 2 years. And he was the first president of the North Carolina Association of Black Lawyers and was also involved in a number of other civil rights cases. I think, and I'm not sure that he was involved in another sort of bus-type litigation. I couldn't find it. The attorney who represented the two defendants in Asheville, and Gene is correct, they were tried in the district court, they were convicted, but unlike here, the DA there did not take the case to Superior Court and seek a conviction there. So that case ended with the appeal, but Curtis Todd, a black attorney from Winston-Salem, represented the two defendants there, and Curtis Todd, from all accounts, was just an amazing attorney, an amazing person, and he, like C.J. Gates, was not afraid, not intimidated by taking on cases that were unpopular. And there's more that could be said about all of these, but I want to mention those. So those are the attorneys, and you heard some about the facts, the circumstances, what was being said in court, and I don't know whether it was Ed or Gates who said to the judge, when the judge was saying, well, I'm gonna, because, the white defendant was Jewish and he knew better and he took advantage of this poor black, and the attorney, I think it was Ed Avant, said, well, Judge, that's racial discrimination. You can't do that. He was that blatant about it. He didn't pull his punches, but that's the sort of representation that they were willing to embark upon even during that time. I do want to mention a couple of other lawyers, though, before I sit down, related to segregation on transportation. One is a lawyer by the name of Charlie Bell. Charlie Bell actually was from my hometown of Plymouth. Interesting story, his father, Pete Bell, graduated from law school and started practicing law in 1901. If you know anything about the history of North Carolina, especially as it relates to racial history, 1901 was part of that period we call the nadir. But anyway, his son, Charlie Bell, was licensed to practice law in 1951, which is the same year I was born. That's another reason I think about this guy. But he left, his father convinced him to leave Plymouth to go to Charlotte, North Carolina, because the president of the NAACP in Charlotte felt the need for some good lawyers to help address some of the issues, related to justice in Charlotte. And so that's what Charlie Bell did. And within 2 months of his going, after having passed the bar, it's the same year that he passed the bar, he's in Charlotte. He's going to go to some legal training program in South Carolina. He's on the bus. The bus stops in Gastonia, and it's in Gastonia that Charlie Bell was asked to move to the back of the bus because you're riding in a section of the bus that's reserved for white folk. Charlie Bell refused to move. Now, mind you, lawyers are not the most risk-taking people. Because they want to stay in good stead with the state bar. You want to keep your license. That's your livelihood. And this man had just passed the bar. But he said, hell no, I'm not going to move. He was arrested. He was charged. He fought the case, the criminal case. He won, but he didn't stop there. He filed a civil lawsuit against the town of Gastonia and against the bus company, and he prevailed, I understand. I don't know how much money, but Charlie Bell is someone else I think about when we talk about Jim Crow and bus transportation. You can't talk about this and not talk about Dovey Mae Roundtree. And she's someone, if you don't know about her, you need to read the biography. I think it's Justice Older Than the Law. Just an amazing woman, an amazing lawyer, an amazing person. But long story short, she took on the case of wow, her name's escaping me now. I shouldn't. Krista, you know who I'm talking about. Sarah Keyes, that's right. In 19, I think it was 1952, that Sarah Keyes, here again, a military person in uniform, on her way home to Washington, North Carolina, bus stops in Roanoke Rapids. She's told to go to the back of the bus. She doesn't, and she ends up prosecuted, and charged with various offenses, that sort of thing. Her parents end up getting the NAACP to be involved. They refer the case to Dovey Roundtree, who had just graduated from Howard Law School, I think a year or two before. But at any rate, she ends up taking the case. She takes it all the way to the Interstate Commerce Commission, and where after a couple of years, they get a result. The first time the Interstate Commerce Commission ever ruled that it was unconstitutional to segregate riders based upon race in interstate transportation. That's Dovey Mae Roundtree's case, her legal work, and Sarah Keys was the plaintiff. That's worth keeping in mind. I'll mention one other attorney. I know we're running short on time, but Charlie Jones, Charles Jones, actually, was a student at Johnson C. Smith University, during the late 50s, early 60s. He's one of the founding members of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as it relates to bus transportation. He was one of the few freedom riders in 1961 from North Carolina. He ended up serving with the other SNCC riders and others at Parchman Prison in Mississippi. He went on to eventually go to law school, and he practiced law in Charlotte until his death a couple of years ago. He was a committed warrior for justice, not just in his young years, but in his older years, and so I did want to mention him also. And the other thing I mentioned about him, he was a part of the sit-in movement. And in Rock Hill, I think when, early on in the 1960s, when they were sitting in a drugstore or some facility in Rock Hill, they were arrested, he and several others. And that's when Charles Jones and others said, when they said, well, somebody's going to come to bail us out, Charles said, jail, no bail. He said, we're going to sit here in this jail, and we're going to make a point, on this thing, and so worth mentioning. So there's more that could be said. I did want to, though, I know we're running a little late on time. I did want to give, before I have our judges make their comments, I want to mention Miss Mandy Carter, who is an activist, organizer, movement builder for over 50 years, social, racial, LGBTQ issues. So let's acknowledge her, and I also want to give her a chance to say a few words if she's inclined to.
I actually read readings from Durham, North Carolina, and I got lost. What's new? But I want to say I'm so humbled and honored to be here on behalf of the War Resistance League, which turns 100 years old in 2023. Egon Verdejo, Jim Peck, Bayard Rustin had that connection. But also I want to thank an organization called the National Black Justice Coalition and the Pauli Murray movement.
Right.
In 2012, I think my years are right, women were supposed to be on that freedom ride in 1947.
Right.
So Ella Baker and Pauli Murray. So the National Black Justice Coalition and Pauli Murray got together and said, we're going to walk from the Pauli Murray marker that's right up here on Chapel Hill Street to the marker here in Chapel Hill. And we all wore shirts dedicated to women of the civil rights movement.
Mm.
So we had Virginia Williams, who was still alive at the time, and she walked with us as well. But we called it Still Walking for Justice, the 2012 commemoration of the 1947 journey of reconciliation, Women's Walk from Durham to Chapel Hill. I only say this because I'm sitting here so amazed about the moment in which we sit and we hear the incredible songs of my sister. I walked in, I know. But I just want to say something that you just mentioned earlier, too. We're now looking at a demographic shift in this country, the only one I know. And I think a lot of what I would perceive to be outrageousness about voter suppression and LGBTQ and people of color is called desperation because the demographics have shifted. Time has changed. 226 years to get a black woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. 106 to get a mayor over in Durham, North Carolina.
Yeah.
I can't believe what we have come through. And my brother, the poetry. Moment, and you know it. So the question is not just again, but how and when, but how do we then proactively talk about song, works, civil rights, in all languages and all cultures. So that's it.
All right. Well, thank you. So now I want to have members of our district court, give them an opportunity to make a comment. You know, when we're thinking about doing something related to this issue, as I mentioned, you know, there was an injustice. And one of the things that I wanted to see if it could happen was a way to reckon with that, if there was some way to offer some sense of repair. I know it couldn't be undone in terms that would benefit the 4 defendants who were actually convicted and sent to the chain gang. But if there's something that we could do as a community, as a society, to say, we recognize the wrong and we want to be accountable and we want to reckon with it in some way to the extent we can. You know, I think there's some thought being given to that. I won't say too much more because I don't want to steal thunder of our judicial officials. So I will turn it over to them at this point.
All right, good afternoon. My name's Samantha Cabe. I'm the Chief District Court Judge for this district, and I stand here with 3 of my 4 colleagues. First of all, Judge Hathaway Pendergrass, Judge Joel Brown, and Judge Sherry Merle. Our 5th judge, Todd Roper, couldn't be here with us today. We cover 2 counties, and he's not in Orange County today. But he, too, joins in the statement that we are going to make jointly today. I'm going to start us off, and we'll each read a part of the statement. The Freedom Riders, who were attacked by an angry mob in Chapel Hill in April 1947, were charged with disorderly conduct and were tried on those charges before a judge in Orange County Recorder Court in May 1947. Recorder Court was the local court which later became the district court, which is the court in which we sit. A judge in Orange County sentenced the men to 30 days on a chain gang. The Orange County Court was on the wrong side of the law in May 1947, and it was on the wrong side of history. Today, we stand before our community on behalf of all 5 of our district court judges and accept the responsibility entrusted to us to do our part to eliminate racial disparities in our justice system.
We are committed to serving this community with open eyes and open hearts, willing to see, acknowledge, and take intentional steps to rectify the biases and effects of systemic racism that are still present in our courts today.
On behalf of the District Court for Judicial District 15B, we acknowledge that Andrew Johnson, James Felmet, Bayard Rustin, and Eagle Radunkis did not receive fair and equal treatment in our court in May 1947.
We offer our sincere apology to the men who were prosecuted, to their families, to our community, and to all people of color who continue to be subjected to the unconstitutional laws of segregation because of local courts failing to follow the federal precedent.
Well, I know it's Friday, and I know it's after 4 o'clock, and so it is time that we close. I do want to thank our judges for that statement. Thank you so much. And I don't think I'll be remiss in saying that I believe there's some thought being given to a motion for appropriate relief at a later date in June that should result in the dismissal of those convictions. I don't want to make a formal announcement because I don't know that all the details have been worked out yet, but we'll keep you posted on that. So with that being said, thank you all for attending, and let's stay on the journey for justice. Thank you.